Hey all, Cara here, and I just wanted to let you know right at the top of the show how excited I am that Talk Nerdy is sponsored this week by Mel Science, a subscription service that offers monthly science boxes combining hands-on experiments with VR and AR technologies to engage kids in studying science, but not just kids, really kids of all ages. I had the opportunity to play and learn from the medicine box, and it is amazing. I was able to learn how to take blood pressure, to listen to my own chest with a stethoscope, to learn all about pulse ox and even more. And it's not just medicine. There are chemistry sets, physics sets, and they're really in-depth and fascinating. Science is all about exploration, experiments, discovering, and asking questions. This all comes naturally to your kiddos, less so to adults, but Mel Science inspires it nonetheless. And get this, right now, oh, I'm so excited. If you visit the Mel Science website and use my promo code NERDY, you will get 60% off your first order. That's MELScience.com and use my special promo code NERDY, or visit my website and look at the show notes for a special link. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, February 14th, 2022, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. You know what that means? Happy Valentine's Day, everyone. And if you're listening to this late Sunday night or early Monday morning, you still have time to go out and grab a card, some flowers, if you've completely forgotten. Today's episode, I think, is especially relevant on Valentine's Day. You will find out why in just a minute. But before we dive into it, I do want to thank those of you who support the show. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download as long as I keep cranking out episodes. 8 years, y'all. What? And that's because I do really rely on the support of listeners just like you. You keep this show going. And so I want to give a shout out to my top patrons this week. They include Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, Christopher Pitts, Dudas Infinitas, Gabriel F. Jaramillo Gonzalez, June Sapara, Leonard Prince, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all from the bottom of my heart. If you're interested in supporting the show, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy, or you can go to talknerdy.com. You can see all of the episodes there, and you can learn more about how to pledge your support. All right. So in honor of Valentine's Day, actually, it's not really, this is kind of a fluke, but it is pretty funny. I have a great chat today. I had the opportunity to talk to Florence Williams. Now, Florence is the author of 2 previous books. Her first, Breasts, won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and then she wrote The Nature Fix. She's also a contributing editor at Outside Magazine and has written for a ton of different outlets like the New York Times, National Geographic, and, et cetera, et cetera. But her newest book is called Heartbreak, a personal and scientific journey. So we're going to tell the story of her own heartbreak and then her journey to understand why she felt the way that she felt, from all the way from her biology to her genetics to her psychology, and what she could, of course, do about it. So a little bit of a different Valentine's Day, a Valentine's Day with a twist, but one that is relevant to each and every one of us. So without any further ado, here she is, Florence Williams. Well, Florence, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Cara. Thanks for having me on.
So I'm really excited to talk about your newest book, Heartbreak, a personal and scientific journey. And what a personal and scientific journey it is. This is such a different approach to science writing. I was so thrilled when it came across my desk because as somebody who studies psychology, but works heavily in a sort of skeptic role in some of the other podcast work that I do and some of the advocacy and really activism that I do, I often find that I don't know, sort of the hard sciences, the wet sciences, a little bit of turning their nose up to the psychological sciences, and I find sometimes even within the skeptic community that like feelings and emotions have somehow like they have a negative connotation. They're carried like they're bad words, like we must be critical and we must use logic and reason, and emotion is antithetical to logic and reason, which I do not believe is the case at all. So I'm very happy that you dug into the connections in your book between the physical, the psychological, and the stuff that you cannot separate because it's inextricably linked.
Yeah, thank you so much. I feel the same way. I mean, emotions haven't really gotten their due. I mean, they're starting to, compared to where I think, where psychology even was, 20 or 30 years ago, through the
Right.
important role that emotions play in our physical health. And I felt like you almost had to write a personal book in order to convey, this sort of weight behind that statement. By writing in the first person, by talking about my own heartbreak, I think the science, in some ways helped ground the narrative for me journalistically and helped. But I also think that the personal story really served the science. It went both ways.
Was that a departure for you? Because this is what, your third book. You've written, a fair amount of pieces in different outlets. And, as somebody who has written quite a lot of science, was it odd for you to kind of peel back that curtain and expose yourself in that way?
It both was and wasn't different. My other two books were also written in the first person, but loosely and not very much. A little bit goes a long way. But I'm used to kind of using my own body almost as a proxy for talking about, for example, the effects of toxic chemicals, on breast milk. I had my own breast milk analyzed for that. In the Nature Fix, I went around wearing an EEG cap to record my brain waves in different environments. Not as a way to just like talk about myself, but hey, we all have brains, and this is how they work, and I'm going to present this in a first person way, as a way to be sort of conversational and sometimes funny, and hopefully keep people engaged. So with this book, it was the same impulse, only I had to go much deeper. I had to really, as you say, roll that curtain back even more, to tell a very intimate and in some ways, difficult story.
And difficult it was. I mean, clearly it was difficult in that it was the impetus to dig into these explanations and these experiences, but also difficult in that there was both, or I shouldn't say both because I'm contributing now to this like binary, but there was this um, exceedingly biological, psychological, biopsychosocial experience that you had in loss. This is a book about love, but it's also a book about, in some ways, the antithesis to that, or the counterbalance to that, which is heartbreak, which is loss. And so, maybe before we get into what you learned through the process, you can tell us a little bit about that loss.
Yeah, sure. I think it is important to at least, nod to it. I had been married for 25 years, had just turned 50, but had actually met the man who would be my husband when I was 18. So we were actually together for 3 decades, like my entire adult life. And, what happened is that we got to a point where he said to me, I think I need to go find my soulmate, and
Oh
you're
my
not it.
God.
And so it was a surprise. It was devastating. Um, it was I'd never experienced heartbreak before because I had been with one person for so long, starting in my teens. And I was just really knocked out by not just the emotional impact of it, but how my body responded and how my body registered, that pain. And so I had trouble sleeping. I lost a ton of weight that I didn't want to lose. And I started getting sick. So the way I describe it in the book is that I kind of felt like I was plugged into a faulty electrical outlet. There's this feeling of intense agitation and fear, like what's going to happen to me now? What's my future? I'm afraid. I'm afraid to be alone. but also this feeling of exhaustion, so agitation and exhaustion, and my body just being incredibly stressed out. And so I knew when I was getting sick, I got diagnosed with an autoimmune disease, which was type 1 diabetes as an adult. It's pretty unusual. I knew that, I needed to get better as soon as possible. And I also really wanted to understand what was happening, on a cellular level, like what was happening to my immune system. There was so much art about heartbreak, but there was so little science.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I noticed that Helen Fisher did a blurb on your book, and she's probably, if I were to think of somebody who's written, most extensively about like love and about the
Yes.
neuroscience of love, she's kind of who I would point to. And sadly, I think that she doesn't get the respect. I mean, I think she does get respect in certain circles. And in other circles, unfortunately, I think a lot of neuroscientists are like, oh yeah, that's just too subjective. That's just it's not really our purview to go there. And so it doesn't even get talked about because it's hard to talk about. And I get it. Like mentioned before, I'm working on my PhD in clinical psychology, and I worked with a professor for some time at my university on some research that she was doing into creativity. And it was frustrating because what is creativity? How do you operationally define it? And once you do, how the hell do you study it? I mean, there's a reason I think that scientists shy away from these things because they're ineffable to a certain extent.
And yet, there's an increasing recognition of the incredible importance of human attachment in determining so much of how we move through the world, right? So much of our grief and our hope and our sense of community and our sense of self. These things are all really so influenced and informed by the deep attachments we have in our lives. And so I do think there's an increasing recognition of this. It's a fascinating area of study. More and more we're becoming aware that loneliness, for example, has a real effect on how healthy people are.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
It's as significant a risk factor for early death and disease as smoking and obesity, and yet it's only recently sort of gotten that kind of recognition.
Absolutely. I feel like in the mental health field, we've long known that loneliness, isolation is probably the number one risk factor for kind of a difficult recovery path. But yeah, it's taken a while within sort of the broader medical community to see that something that's not often even asked about in a clinical interview.
And one of society's sort of biggest health challenges right now is addiction and opioid addiction. And there's a really direct link actually between craving, this sort of opioid engagement and the stimulation on receptors looking for a drug. Direct correlation to looking for love and looking for attachment. These are the same receptors.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Yeah. And I mean, it really kind of opens up so many opportunities. And as you sat down to write this book, did you write the whole thing after the fact, or did you write it as you were sort of coping and growing and healing as a mechanism to do so?
A little bit of both, I would say. I did a lot of the reporting and research, right away as it was happening to me. So, for example, I have an interview. I had a meeting, a couple meetings with Helen Fisher right after the split. And I was like, Helen, please tell me what is happening to my brain. And she said, oh, kiddo, sit down, have a cup of tea. I'm so sorry you're going through this. Let me explain to you what's happening. So for me, as someone experiencing heartbreak in the moment, it was really helpful and validating, to talk to these scientists, um, all of whom, by the way, said to me, "Oh, you poor dear, I've also gone through heartbreak. Let me tell you about my heartbreak." And so it was very humanizing, I think, for the book to present the scientists in a sort of human way. And I did some of the writing, early on, but a lot of that writing I had to rewrite,
Sure, sure.
later, like years later, with the perspective of, not feeling quite so raw and in the middle of it.
Yeah, it's always so interesting. One of the things I often discuss with my patients in therapy is this idea that like it's the difference between sort of after the fact hindsight and being in something and the perspective shift that occurs once you're sort of out of it or once you've grown through it, and how it's very hard for us. And so this must have been a challenge for you. I mean, I'm making an assumption, but based on my own anecdotal experience and a lot of sort of first person reporting from working with patients, it's very hard to empathize with your past self. It's very hard to sort of put yourself in your own shoes at a time when your emotions were overwhelming, because your hindsight later sees a clarity that and a perspective that you just don't have at that time.
I think that's probably true, and it also just presented challenges from a literary perspective because you don't necessarily wanna write from the sort of raw emotion. You don't wanna write from the wound as much as from the scar. If you're trying to write something that's, readable, you
Yeah.
need the writer, I think, needs a certain amount of distance. Now, I mean, I was still writing it, relatively soon after the split, but there's a big difference between sort of doing the revisions and the rewrites, 2 and 3 years later, as opposed to like, weeks and months later.
Right. This is not a book of like emo song lyrics. This is like an actual investigation. And so, I usually think as a practitioner about experiences from a binary sort of perspective. I often think about the assessment and then I think about the intervention, right? Like, what is going on? I want to understand exactly, what's happening in my brain, in my body. I want to know, is this pathological? Is this normal? And then beyond that, what can I do about it? How can I feel peace? How can I feel safety? And so I'm curious, is that, I mean, maybe not in the moment, but is that sort of a way that you conceptualized, or do you have a sort of different um, protocol as a journalist?
No, I think absolutely you said it perfectly that, it was through the reporting and the researching and the trying to understand, please help me understand what's happening to my body. That in itself was very helpful to me, just personally. It's how I, process questions in my life, sort of through the lens of science journalist. I think it helps give me maybe a little bit of detachment, which was great. It's like let's engage my cognitive system here. I want to know, want to understand, and then it also, I think, really opened up all these doors to the healing journey itself. Like now that I know what I need to do to feel better, um, this is going to help me, sort of map the road from here on.
Right. So, yeah, maybe we can even kind of take this conversation into that conceptualization. Like, we can start with some of the insights, the sort of assessments that you discovered as you went. And then after that, we can talk a little bit about the interventions, the things that you learned, the tools that you learned to try and achieve that peace, achieve that safety, and start that healing journey. So early on, you're broken, right? You're feeling completely fractured and you're wondering, not only why do I feel so ill in my mind, but why do I feel so ill in my body? So what were some of the first people you mentioned? You reached out to Helen Fisher because she's sort of the obvious go-to,
Yeah,
like
she
she's the
was just
love neuroscientist.
weeks after the split. She said, when she called me kiddo. She's 20 years older than me. She's, completely warm, lovely person. She's like, listen, kiddo, I can tell you what's happening. She has done one of the few studies actually putting dumped people, people rejected by love, in a brain scanner, is showing them pictures of their sort of rejecting beloved, scanning their brains and seeing that where their brains are active is in sort of two interesting areas. One is in the area of craving and addiction. So, just because you've lost love doesn't mean that you stop loving that person. You're still missing them. You're sort of in some ways craving them. Your body is sort of craving them because your bodies co-regulate. This is the person you've slept next to for 3 decades and your heart rates are the same and your respiration levels are the same. Your cortisol levels align, in the mornings and the evenings. So when that kind of primary attachment figure disappears, your body sort of freaks out. It's like, wait, where is that co-regulating force in my life? Where is that sense of security, Where's that sense of safety? Where's my home base? Feels like it's suddenly gone. And so the other place in your brain that really gets active, is the brain region associated with physical pain. Very similar to what's happening when you experience emotional pain. You know,
And
your
it does feel physical.
It does feel physical, and poets tell us this all the time. I mean, the metaphors of heartbreak, like literally, they're about pain and they're about being broken. And it's that way because our brains take social pain incredibly seriously. As human animals, we need these people around us in order to be safe. And our nervous systems know that. There's safety in numbers. We need close people around us, to help us raise our young and to help us cooperatively hunt and make meaning and culture, all of these things. So that really validated what I was feeling, which was this feeling of being unsafe. And it became clear to me that, when we're left by someone like that, our primary attachment figure, our nervous systems kind of respond as if we are literally left alone on the savannah and we're being circled by hyenas. Because in our deep human past, that is, in fact, what it meant to be alone. You were less safe,
Right. It's a
more
threat. It's a
vulnerable.
legit, and it's not just that you're less safe, but you're like actively experiencing threat. You're very vulnerable.
Yeah, and so your body, you're pumping out all these stress hormones. Your body was really going into fight or flight because it's expecting that that's what's going to happen. Doesn't make the distinction, that this is just a social rejection. So it started to sort of make sense to me that way. It became clear to me that in order to heal, I was first going to have to learn how to calm down, not be so acutely, threatened. And so one of the next people I spoke to was this fascinating researcher, psychologist at the University of Utah, Paula Williams, who studies what makes people more resilient in the face of life's tragedies. Because if you look at the statistics, the health statistics for people who are divorced, which unfortunately I did, and it was really a bummer. You know, people who are divorced have like the worst health outcomes of anyone, like more so than people who are always single, more so than people in bad marriages, more so than widows and widowers.
Wow, more so than bad marriages? That really surprises me.
I know. I
Hmm.
know. Well, it depends
Okay.
how bad the marriage is. I mean,
Right.
if you feel physically threatened in your marriage,
Right. If it's abusive and you're
if
dealing
it's
with those kind
abusive,
of adverse.
yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if it's
Yeah.
sort of like just like a medium sort of bad marriage, but in a predictable way, I mean, there are bad health outcomes associated with that. Don't get me wrong, but it's still worse if you're newly divorced. 23% increased risk of early death, 24% increased risk of heart attack for like the next 9 years, increased risk of diabetes and dementia. I mean, it just goes on and on. But she said to me, look, we know some people, just really sail through this and are more resilient. And I just kind of leaned forward and I said, please tell me who these people are. What's the secret sauce? Because I want to be one. I need to feel better. And she said, well, what we are finding in our lab is that it's the people who are able to really appreciate beauty and cultivate awe. Um, these are the people who are able to make the most sense of their tragedies, sort of tell themselves stories, in which they come through okay.
Yeah, I mean that just it aligns so deeply with sort of the literature on existential psychotherapy and this kind of idea of meaning making. This idea of like, I often think about it like, again, here comes my binary self, very human of me, that, oftentimes in psychology, but also I think in the medical community as a whole, we look at diagnostics, we look at, quote, pathology, and we think about how do we make it better? How do we fix it? How do we take this quote bad thing and improve it or overcome it? But I think what we often don't think about is that the equal and opposite side of that equation is what is right, what is going well, where are the strengths, and how do we lean into those things? How do we identify all the good that is happening even amongst this background of garbage, and how do we find the meaning and the hope and the joy
The
in the
growth.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Right, and people were telling me, "Oh, there is this thing, post-traumatic growth, it's
Mhm.
possible," and, at the time, I was like, really? I don't believe it. It doesn't," I don't how is this ever gonna feel good?" But I was someone who was already prone to, appreciate nature, as a
Mhm,
source of
yeah.
beauty. Had written this book, The Nature Fix. I was like, yeah, if anything can cure me, maybe it's nature. But that conversation with her really did determine the course of the next 2 years as I sort of desperately tried to find beauty. If this was going to be the cure to my heartbreak, I was going to get on it. Bring it on. Bring me some beauty. I was ready.
I love that. And so as you sort of dug into this new journey to find beauty, right? To lean into awe. You also continued to learn about what was going on in your mind and your body. You continued to talk to different researchers, right? Like everything from neuroscientists to psychologists to even like anthropologists to try to understand, what's going on with me. As you went through that journey of self discovery, was there anything that really surprised you? Kind of like that divorce statistic really, really surprises me. Was there anything like that that felt almost counterintuitive or like, oh my God,
Well, I
seriously?
think, one of the central sort of scientific investigations in the book was working with a geneticist, an immunogeneticist named Stephen Cole at UCLA. And uh, as I was trying to understand why I was getting sick, he said to me, my lab has been investigating why it is that lonely people are dying earlier and getting sick. And, we analyzed 200 genes in the genome that we think are particularly linked in these white blood cells, these transcription factors that turn our genes on and off, that are really changing the immune profile of people who report feeling lonely. And he said, "Why don't you come into the lab and we'll look at your blood and we'll see what's going on with your white blood cells, and then we'll do it again, in 6 months or 12 months, and then we'll do it again after that, and we'll see if you're actually able to sort of work your way out of heartbreak." And I thought that was fascinating. And the reasons that he told me our immune system changes, I thought were really surprising and fascinating. And it's mostly that when people feel lonely, when they feel like they're alone in the world, uh, they upregulate genes for inflammation. And it's probably because, their bodies think that they are literally walking through the jungle by themselves and they are perhaps about to be attacked by a predator or they're about to get injured. So their bodies are preparing for a flesh wound. But the reason these other changes happen is that, our immune systems unfortunately cannot do everything. I mean, it's a limited resource, and so if they're putting a lot of energy into inflammation, they're actually going to turn down the transcription factors, the genes for fighting viruses. So we turn up inflammation, we turn down virus fighting capability, which is why people with HIV, for example, who he spent years and years studying, if they say that they don't have enough social support, they produce fewer T cells. They progress to full blown disease faster and they die earlier. We're seeing this also now in studies with chimps who are given SIV, simian immunovirus deficiency, a virus, and then if they're socially isolated, if they're placed in cages by themselves, they also progress to disease more quickly. So I thought that was fascinating. I thought his sort of evolutionary explanation was fascinating that, maybe we're about to get attacked by a beast. At the same time, because we're alone, we don't need the virus protection because viruses are spread in groups. But of course, it turns out to be exactly the wrong response, for sort of living in modern life.
Yeah, where we're not gonna be, like, injured on the street simply because we may be, but it's not, yeah, our risk is a lot different.
And in fact, guess what? There's a pandemic. So we need the viral protector.
Yeah. It's interesting because it's an explanation that doesn't require a specific genetic like a gene locus, because what I was concerned about and what I'm often concerned about, I see a lot, is this desire to, like, what's the gene for loneliness, right?
Right.
Like where in your genome are lonely people, like they must have more, or they must have a mutation on this one region, and not lonely people must not. And I think it's such a simplistic view, and I was worried about the kind of uh, formula that way. But this idea that it's obviously a multi-genetic phenomenon has much more to do with your sympathetic nervous system, and upregulation and downregulation of multiple genes that are involved in your immune response. And exactly what you said, it makes so much sense, this idea that sort of the same immune system is responsible for fighting viruses, that's responsible for keeping a wound clean.
Really what we're talking about are epigenetics, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
our immune systems are brilliant in that they are designed to respond to real-time events.
Yeah. They're
Um,
fast.
they're fast. These are, white blood cells get made in your bone marrow. They get released, every day, and they're going to change. The sort of formula for those cells is going to get changed depending on your circumstances. So grief and loneliness are actually epigenetic factors predisposing us to illness.
Right. They're behavioral. They're things that exist that influence the upregulation, the downregulation,
That's
the
right.
turning on, the turning off of genes, and in a profound way, it sounds like.
Yes.
I'm actually really curious. I don't know if you sort of got to the bottom of this, or if there is a bottom of this to get to, but of course, I'm asking very selfishly and narcissistically. I am somebody who spends a lot of time alone, and I love being alone, and I actually struggle with traditional relationships because of that. And I'm sort of, if I personally think I'm pretty healthily attached, but I probably tend towards avoidant attachment style a little bit. And so I feel like my experience is very different from a lot of the people that I talk to, a lot of the people that I know who need much more sort of human connection. I do need it. I mean, I am still a social creature and I love it, but I also require a lot of rebound time by myself after, and it's very
Yeah.
hard for me to share a space with people. And I'm
Yeah.
wondering, what's the obviously I think there's behavioral explanations and developmental explanations, but what did, for example, the geneticist or the
Yeah.
anthropologist say about those differences, those individual differences?
I mean, I did learn a little bit about that. It makes sense that, we all have very different personalities. We have different needs. Humans are incredibly variable in how we have relationships, how we pursue relationships. And loneliness is a concept I learned that is really subjective. So it's not the same as social isolation. Loneliness is a feeling that
Right. You
some
can be
people have and
alone and
some
not
people
feel
don't.
lonely.
Exactly. You can
Yeah,
be in a marriage and feel lonely.
for sure.
You can be in a city and feel lonely. Or you can be alone and feel like, oh my God, I love being alone. Like you said, I can get so much work done and I get a lot of fulfillment from my creative mind that can, run wild when I'm not distracted and so on and so forth. If you feel comfortable and great and safe in your, sort of a somewhat isolated state, then you're not going to feel
Mhm.
like you're threatened.
Right.
So your immune system is probably just great. And in fact, this was so fascinating. What Steve Cole told me is that he thinks the antidote to loneliness is not necessarily sociality or sociability. The antidote to loneliness is purpose and mission. So
Oh,
if
I love
you are
that.
feeling, that you are really fulfilled in a sort of cosmic sense, like that is the best thing for your immune system. I thought that was really fascinating.
And that makes a lot of sense too, because I think that, there are so many different, like you said, personality factors, and there's introversion and there's extroversion. There's a million different ways to slice and dice this. And some people get overwhelmed with too much stimulation and they need that time. And other people require a lot of stimulation to kind of reach a baseline. But this idea of meaning, of purpose, and a lot of existential psychologists divide it into sort of two different buckets. We have our meaning in the experience, so the day to day, everything we do. Am I finding awe in these like small things? And then the sort of horizon purpose, that thing you can never quite reach, like the greater meaning of your life. And if you have a foot in both of those pools, whether you're alone or with others, or hopefully finding a balance between the two, um, there's a fulfillment. I guess that's what it is, right? It's a fulfillment.
Yeah, your body just loves that. Your white blood
Right.
cells love it if you are, feeling like your life has meaning, like you're going places you want to go, like you're connected and sort of engaged to, these cosmic questions, that you're pursuing. If you feel sort of spiritually fulfilled, and part of that means, fulfilled in your mission, whatever, purpose is another one of those ineffable words, but your body somehow seems to know when you have optimism about the world and about your place in it.
Well, and it probably does translate to a safety, a sense of calm. This is why interventions like mindfulness, like breathing techniques, like grounding techniques can really be important for anxiety and especially for chronic stress, right? Because when you're grounded and you start to feel a sense of security and safety, a foundation, um, a lot of those sort of Robert Sapolsky, why zebras don't get ulcers, right? Like chronic inflammatory responses are quieted.
That's right, and you see, even in sort of monks, and spiritual leaders who do live alone or, are not, in personal close relationships, they're super healthy, if you look at their immune systems. And, um, in terms of, what their nervous systems are doing, it looks really good.
This now I want to do a study. I am inspired now because I'm curious if we look at. I'm very interested in aging because I work in cancer and in end of life kind of therapy, and I'm curious if we were to look at um, older individuals who either struggle with loneliness, because we know that it's almost an epidemic amongst older individuals because of the way that we do elder care in our country. um, so those who struggle with loneliness and have a lot of the associated health consequences, and if we were also to look at older people who sort of identify as or fall under the model of, I don't know, have you heard much about gerotranscendence?
No, what is that?
So there's this fascinating, it's sort of in developmental psychology, as you were looking through like attachment style and stuff like that. I mean, we often see that developmental psychology, there's a lot of time spent on youth, right? There's all these individual stages from age 3 to 4. This is what happens from 4 to 5. This, and then by the time we're like 30, we're like, and then you're old. And then, like,
You're done.
nobody
You're
talks
baked.
about the differences, right? And so Eric Erickson, who's one of the most famous sort of developmental psychologists, as he was aging and dealing with severe dementia, his wife continued to, she carried the torch a lot, actually, just didn't get credit, but she continued to carry that torch and write about this later in life phenomenon, which was then picked up by this guy named, I think, Lars Torstam. And the idea is that in gerotranscendence, you see a very specific phenomenon where some older individuals feel very um, at peace. They are very much tapped into this idea of awe and meaning and purpose, but they increasingly spend more and more time alone.
Hmm.
And
Yeah. Mhm.
they don't want to engage in sort of worldly, they disengage from technology very often. They like to spend more time in nature. It's a lot of like self-contemplative, meditative time. And within this sort of slice of the population, there are very positive mental health outcomes, but only particular people
That's really
find
fascinating.
themselves. Yeah, in this
Well,
in
that
this
seems aligned with,
mhm.
what Paula Williams was telling me about
It
this
would be
capacity for beauty.
yes, it would be so cool to see if you really can find a distinction between those in gerotranscendence and those struggling with loneliness.
Well, you should work with Dr. Cole and take a look at their 200 transcription factors.
Right. Oh my gosh, so they really are digging deep into the genome.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so what you looked at your own, right? Were you just full of inflammatory factors?
Oh, yeah, I was. In fact, he said that, my first blood sample, pretty close after my marriage fell apart was, he said, "Yeah, you have the blood of a lonely person."
Oh my
I
gosh.
was like, "Ouch." And then, I tried all these things to get better. And some of them moved the needle on my white blood cells, made them look better. Some of them didn't. so,
Yeah.
so it was super interesting.
I'm curious as somebody who really respects the scientific method and really is a firm believer in evidence-based treatment and has, a hard skeptical bent, but also as somebody who works within a field that doesn't have a lot of evidence supporting it simply because it doesn't lend itself to the classic randomized controlled trial model. Which is individual long-term psychotherapy. It's just very hard to study because it's so particularly tailored to the individual, and especially these sort of humanistic existential interventions. I'm really curious, you did a lot. You everything from like psychedelics to like different, psychological interventions to these like sort of like spending more time in nature. Did you find anything that felt like patently pseudoscientific? Was there anything that was like, okay, this is snake oil. This is sort of clearly practitioners or charlatans are preying on lonely people and taking
Well,
advantage of them?
yeah, a little bit. I mean, I felt like some of the sort of myths, the sort of bromides, the standard advice you kind of hear about heartbreak, I felt like some of them were kind of, for me, just empty and in fact didn't have a lot of science behind them. Whereas there were other things that you're told sort of not to do that that actually worked, and there was science behind those things. So one example of that is, I think often in after long marriages end, you hear this advice that, oh, you shouldn't jump into another relationship too soon. Um,
Ooh, I
you know,
love the rebound. I
there
find the
you
rebound
go.
is very
I'm
healing
all
for
about the
me.
rebound, right? But so many people would say, "Oh, you need to love yourself first. You need to heal
Right.
yourself first." And I was like, I don't know. Where's the science? Where's the science that says I shouldn't have a rebound? And in fact, there's some good science saying you should have a
Nice.
rebound. That
Good
people
for
who have a
self-esteem.
rebound, it's good for self-esteem. It's good for self-confidence. That physical touch actually does calm your nervous system if it's someone you trust. And that's maybe a high bar these days on the dating market. But if
Right.
you can find someone you trust, and really trust, then you'll feel safer. I mean, I was checking my blood sugars, after nights when I was dating people, and my blood sugar was better. My nervous system was better.
And a lot of it has to do with what
So
you're trying to get out of it, right? Like, I think having companionship for a night versus having companionship
right.
for a year, like the bar for trust is very different. Like, do I feel safe is a very different thing. Like, can I engage with this person physically, or can I have a nice time for a night or for a week or for whatever, versus am I going to, be vulnerable and give them all of my past trauma and all the things that come with
Right.
with a
Right.
long-term relationship.
Right. Yeah, I think there's kind of probably a healthy intermediary zone
Right.
there, intermediate zone. If it's just a night or two, you may not feel safe at all, really. Um, so, yeah, I mean, so that was an example of one of the things I did that, was kind of counterintuitive.
Interesting. And so what I hear in sort of that quote advice to sort of love yourself first and is I think an earnest and legitimate argument for self-compassion and self-kindness, but also a pretty blatant assumption that you don't already
Yeah,
have
exactly.
self-compassion, that's why you're
Exactly.
alone.
Exactly. That just didn't hit me right, that kind of
Yeah.
advice. And another thing, is that, people say, "Oh, you should, take care of yourself, self-care, self-care." Facials, massages,
Right.
yoga, whatever. And the science isn't really there either. In fact, Dr. Stephen Cole at UCLA, he has looked at these white blood cells of people who do, sort of, who pursue hedonic happiness, which is sort of like pleasure, what's going to make me feel pleasurable, and has not found that that really has a big effect on their white blood cells or their immune systems, which is so interesting because, we're sold this all the time. Like, you need this face cream to, get this Groupon for this facial, so that you'll, be happier.
Right. It sounds like there's sort of a happy medium that there's, if you're engaging in things because they help you feel safe and calm and centered and
Yeah.
grounded, it's
Yeah.
one
Like
thing
yoga could be really beneficial.
for sure. But if you're
And I
engaging
did a
in
lot of
it,
hot baths. That
oh
was
yeah,
great.
I love a hot bath. I take hot baths all the time. And I
The
don't do it
facial,
because of
maybe
the
not so
health benefits. I do it because it feels good and because it calms me down.
well, there's
And I
something
think,
about warmth, that
yeah,
is really great for as mammals, we like warmth.
it also helps us sleep.
It
I always
does.
feel like, yeah, I'm really tired after a bath, which is good if I'm having a hard time sleeping.
Exactly, exactly.
But
Anything that helps you sleep.
there's this whole sort of like social grossness, and we especially experience it as women, right, with all the internalized sexism and misogyny and kind of patriarchy that is the entire human story,
There's a
right?
little bit of that going on.
Yeah, and this idea of sort of like you need the facial, you need the treatment, you need this like this makeup, you go buy these new clothes that yes, for some people can be empowering and calming and centering, and for other people just contribute to this sense of like I'm not good enough.
Yeah, and like body dysmorphia and
Yeah.
sort of superficial validation, right? All of that. Whereas, in the work that Cole has done, it's people who pursue eudaimonic happiness, which is this happiness that's really associated with, again, the purpose and the meaning, and I'm doing something, that is going to make a difference in the world, that gives me a reason to get up in the morning. Those are the things that may not be mirthful, cheerful, experiences, but they're actually going to really make you feel better.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I like that. And now I'm trying to like square my therapeutic circle because, of course, I also kind of sing the praises of self care, but I very often use the analogy of the oxygen mask on the airplane. That like
Right.
if you don't put your mask
Right.
on first, you're not going to be able to help other people. And so really it's about you have to be in a position to be able to pursue that eudaimonic
That's
uh
right.
yeah, like if
And
you're
and and
falling apart, you're not going to be able to go and be
that's
a part
right.
of the
And
community.
why you can't really heal if you're still in this acute phase of
Right.
fight or flight.
Right, right. And so what do you do though when you're in that acute phase of fight or flight? What were some of the interventions that you came across that did help you? I often use this like very pithy phrase. Honestly, the first 5 times I had a professor who used it a lot, and the first 5 times I heard it, I rolled my eyes, and now I use it all the time because it's deep, even though it doesn't seem so. Is this question of like, do you have your feelings, or do your feelings have you?
Oh, that's nice. Yeah.
Yeah, and so, like, obviously, post heartbreak, post trauma, post, very bad news, kind of boundary experience in life, your feelings have you. You don't have a sense of
That's
control.
right.
You feel like you're drowning. You're really just trying to kick as hard as you can to keep your head above water, and then eventually you get to a place where you can cry and you can regulate that, and it's good to have tears, and it's good to feel the broad spectrum of feelings, but they feel like they are your feelings. They're not controlling you. And so, for me, a lot of it is in the acute phase, it's about getting to the point where you have your feelings don't have you. And then in the more chronic phase of chronic, that's a bad word, long-term phase of psychological intervention, it's about exploring and sort of going towards that purpose and meaning, that horizon. But you were in the acute phase, you were drowning.
I was drowning, and I certainly cried a lot. So then
Yeah.
I'm glad you're saying that was helpful.
Oh
I
yeah.
think it was. I think it was. I think it was. For me, I had this compulsion to sort of move.
Hmm.
I wanted to move my body. I wanted to be outside. I wanted to hear birdsong. I wanted to be able to see the horizon, see the clouds. Um, those things I knew would help me feel a little calmer. And the
Yeah.
science is really there. And I talk a lot about that in my book, The Nature Fix. I also meditated every day. I still am doing that. I think, people talk about how that can help you, right? Sort of have your feelings and not have them have
Yeah.
you. If you can become kind of aware, of how your brain is working, and see these feelings, rise and overtake you. Even just that awareness of how those feelings are working on you, can be helpful. Um, I, tried to also distract myself. Part of that was with friends. Um, Part of that was, I think through the dating, too. I planned a big expedition. And the logistics of that required so much sort of frontal cortex executive function, that also helped sometimes lift me out of kind of my limbic brain.
Yeah,
And
for
I
sure.
tried EMDR therapy too, which is, similar in that you kind of bring up your worst memories, of the heartbreak or of, scenes with your ex or whatever. And then you do this sort of bilateral tapping. In this case, it was tapping, but sometimes it's eye movement back and forth, that, somehow helps decouple your big emotions from the memory itself.
Yeah, I've found EMDR to be a really curious beast because it is technically listed as an evidence-based intervention, but there's still a lot of skepticism as to the mechanism because it doesn't have a lot of face validity. And the best way I've heard it described was uh, there's a psychologist named Dr. Rosen who writes about it as though it's a quote purple hat therapy. So the way he describes it is like, let's say you have somebody who is desperately afraid to drive. They have like severe phobia of driving, and you teach them a lot of grounding techniques and a lot of really legitimate sort of um, uh, CBT approaches to acute anxiety. And then you put a purple hat on them and you say, this purple hat is going to protect you while you drive. And then they go drive. And of course, they fall back on all these grounding techniques and all of these tools that they've already learned. But they say, oh, the purple hat made it so that I could drive. And I worry sometimes that EMDR has a similar thing, that it's actually the therapy that's so beneficial to you. But having this like externalization or this movement or this like secondary sort of thing that makes it marketable
Yeah,
is
I think that there definitely could be a placebo component to the success of, anything. Um, but I have also seen some studies that put EMDR head to head with other forms of therapy, which you think would have that same sort of, therapizing benefit. And the people in EMDR really seem to do better.
Interesting. Yeah, and maybe there is something to be said too about externalizing when you're dealing with something that is so emotionally intense. Being able to externalize a little bit, being able to focus on something else while you are doing some of that
Well,
processing
I think that's what
puts
happens
distance.
with the walking
Yeah,
and with
yeah,
the
yeah.
paddling. When you're walking, it's also bilateral. When you're paddling, it's bilateral. I think you're right. It's like it's engaging and connecting different parts of your brain. And in some ways, it makes sense to me that the EMDR is doing the same thing, except you're sitting still.
Right, right. Except that there's a practitioner with you, which in and of itself is very beneficial, right? Because there's a safety in healing with an expert. There's a safety in healing with somebody who you knew was trained and is licensed and is, following all of the important protocols and who has read all of the books and can help you if you have a panic attack right there in the room, can help you if you really start to experience some deep existential angst or crisis.
That's right.
Yeah. And did you have that ever throughout this whole process? Like, did you find that your heartbreak was ever bordering on, latent mental illness, any pathology that was coming out? Or were you like, this is probably the exact same experience that most everybody goes through?
I did have things like heart racing,
Mm-hmm.
palpitations. I had sort of eye twitching. um, those to me felt like, sort of panic attacks or
Right. Like
yeah,
worrisome.
there was very high anxiety, at
Yeah.
times.
Yeah. Did you find that in your life you tend towards a more anxious reaction to stressors anyway, but it never quite got that bad?
I never thought of myself that way
Mhm.
as struggling with anxiety until I went through this
Interesting.
process, and all of a sudden I became a very anxious person.
Right.
And I talked about this with my therapist. I said, God, am I a really anxious person right now? Or am I an anxious person? Maybe I am, and I didn't know it. And she said, well, you're circumstantially anxious. Like there's a reason you're anxious right now. But I actually think I probably am an anxious person. And I just didn't really know it. I had sort of these other pretty effective ways of coping with it to the
Right,
point
and
where I didn't even know like I was, self medicating.
yeah,
Um,
I mean, and I think most people who have insight, most people who are highly motivated, who have a lot of success in their careers, who are, have a lot of that kind of post-traumatic resilience, that is just it's like you carry these skills without even knowing it, right?
that's
You have
right.
all these
Yeah.
coping mechanisms in your life that help you deal
Until
with.
they don't work all of a
Yep.
sudden.
Yep. Until the external circumstances are so
Right.
great that sub threshold, your threshold's different now.
That's right.
And I
Yeah.
think that that's probably one of the best things that therapeutically can be beneficial is just the validation and the normalization of like, I'm having a normal reaction to an abnormal situation.
Right, and that's very helpful. It gives you a sense of perspective.
Yeah. And
But also I'm glad that I do know that actually maybe I am an anxious person.
right, right.
It gives me a little more self-knowledge, to manage, I think,
Yeah,
some
and I think
situations.
a lot of it they're labels, right? And these are constructs that are designed by people that are we work very hard to try and have these like particular cutoffs, but of course to some extent there's an arbitrariness to them. And so you may not be diagnosable with an anxiety disorder, but you may still tend towards a more anxious reaction to things.
Right, and once you know that, you can, develop some more tools in your toolkit.
Yeah, it's just
Um,
insight, right? First comes insight, then comes action.
I mean, I have
Um,
learned so much about
yeah.
myself through this process, you know, uh, in terms of my mental health, but, also in terms of sort of core identity, in terms of my values. And that's been the kind of beautiful and redemptive part of Heartbreak, that there is this journey of self discovery.
Oh, I love that. And I'm curious, how much do you resonate or identify with that sort of very pithy adage that the only way out is through? Like this wasn't an overnight process for you. You had to
It
feel
wasn't.
it.
Absolutely. I identify with that wholly, completely. And I also came to feel like there is no tidy resolution. There's, people say, "Oh, I want closure. I want closure." Um, Understandable, but expect that you're only going to get maybe partial closure. And so I had this at one point, after talking to a lot of experts on this and psychologists, I had this sort of realization that rather than seeking closure, what I needed to seek was a sense of comfort with not having closure.
Yeah. Yeah. Sort of okayness with the unknown, okayness with the
That's right.
gray and the ambivalence and the
That's
I
right.
don't yeah,
As someone who didn't need the closure quite so much.
And somebody who's, like, really okay with where you are now. Like, I think a lot of times the quote "closure" comes from a desperate need to understand the mindset of the other. You know what I
Maybe.
mean? Like, I
Mhm.
need to know why this happened. Why did he do this? Or why are they thinking that? And how could they do this
Like,
to me?
what happened, what
Yeah,
happened? That
yeah.
makes sense to me.
But, what is your sort of purpose? What is your mission? What is your experience? Where do you find joy and awe? In some ways that is kind of it's an ongoing closure, I guess.
Yeah,
It's a closure
absolutely. I
in
mean, that's what
action.
life is, right? It's an
Yeah.
ongoing and amazingly, I think learning about this and sort of developing this comfort level was incredibly helpful when the
Yeah.
pandemic hit,
Oh, yeah.
because all of a sudden we were collectively facing, this intense uncertainty, unpredictability. Nobody knew what was happening. Everybody felt anxious. And I was like, you know,
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
nothing compared to Heartbreak. Like, I can totally do this.
And, it sort of it just triggers in me this return that I often take in therapy to the serenity prayer. And it's funny because I'm not religious. I'm quite secular. And so, depending on the patients I'm working with, sometimes I'd like take God out of the equation completely. But if they themselves are religious, we might include it. Whatever. To me, it's all the same. But the idea of sort of affecting change where you can, being empowered, feeling a strong sense of you know, uh, solution focused approach where there is a solution to be made,
Right.
sitting with equanimity where you literally have no control over the situation, where it is completely beyond your control, and of course having the wisdom to know the difference, which is the hard part.
I mean, it's all hard. It's all hard. It's all a journey. You're not, there's no sort of destination. You need to work on these things all the time. But I feel like I have more skills now and more
so,
insight.
so do you feel, I think probably the big and hard question is, do you feel different now than you I mean, obviously you feel different now, but are you better for it? Do you still sometimes wish that you were back in that relationship? Are you hopeful to, set your own path? Kind of where
Yeah.
do you find yourself today?
Well, it's not a sort of consistent state, right?
Right.
There's no linear kind of path here. There are moments where you sort of have regrets and sadness and yearning and craving still. But overall, I would say 100%. I feel like I am a different person and I feel like I'm a better person. I feel like I am more open to feelings. I feel like I'm more present for the people in my life. I feel like I'm more empathetic. I feel like I'm a better listener. I feel like I have a greater capacity for love than I did before this experience.
Oh, it really resonates, this kind of um this very existential view that sort of without loss, you really don't fully understand love, without that equal and opposite force. It's very hard to really recognize the depths of your capabilities and the depths of your experience.
Yeah, I think it just we're not always very well taught how to be emotionally intelligent.
Oh, for sure.
And that it
Yeah.
takes something like this, to sort of tear down the walls to
If
be like,
if you have the sort of self motivation and wherewithal to want to learn from it and to want to grow from it, because sadly, something like this can also be incredibly detrimental to somebody who doesn't have either the capacity or the privilege or the support to be able to, go through a personal journey like this. For some people who are really struggling with underlying mental illness, or like we said, don't have a lot of social support, don't have a lot of resources, this can be the straw that
and I
breaks the
think some
camel's back.
people don't recover from heartbreak.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
I just didn't know when I started this journey, if I was gonna be one of those people or not.
But you
But
did. You
I did,
have.
and it really motivated me knowing that I wanted to tell myself a story in which I could be, the agent of my own future.
Ah, I love it. And so I'm going to close with my final two questions. But before I dive into those, last question for you about your journey, about the book, and about where you're at now. Who do you recommend read about this? Like, where in there, obviously the generally curious, sure. But if somebody is experiencing heartbreak, should they read this book during that acute phase? Should they
Yeah,
read it as
absolutely.
they should? Okay.
I think so. I
Yeah.
think so, yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot here that will resonate, with someone who's in the throes of pain.
Yeah.
And I think there are a lot of hopeful messages in the book. So, while there are some bad statistics, some discouraging statistics about health and about, divorced people, I think ultimately there's a lot of hope here.
Love it. Well, gosh, Florence, I know I've already kept you a couple of minutes longer than I said I would, but I was hoping you would share with us your insights on my closing two questions that I ask everybody who comes on the show. They're kind
Okay.
of big picture questions. You ready for
Okay.
them?
Yeah.
All right. So I want you to think in whatever context is relevant to you right now. It could be something you're dealing with in your life. It could be very personal, but it could also be community, global, hell, cosmic. Number one. What is the thing that's keeping you up the most at night right now? The thing you're most concerned about, worried about, maybe even feeling a bit, pessimistic or cynical about? And then on the flip side of that, to kind of lighten things up, where are you finding your hope, your optimism? What are you truly, authentically looking forward to?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would say right now, like a lot of people, I have pretty acute distress about the state of democracy, and sort of our capacity to live together in a diverse society, in a way that, protects everyone's rights and individuality. And I worry about that. I worry about our ability to live through our divisions. But I would say I get the most hope right now from my children and other young people who are so politically engaged, and so knowledgeable, and they care so much that I feel like, if anyone can pull us out of these holes that we're in, it's going to be this emerging generation.
Hear, hear. Well, everyone, the book is Heartbreak, A Personal and Scientific Journey by Florence Williams. Florence, thank you so much for spending the time with us today.
Thank you, Cara. It's been such a pleasure.
And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.